What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the sharp cut of the suit they wear, a nameplate etched in brass on a heavy mahogany door, or the weight of the legacy they carry on their shoulders? Or is it something quieter? Something hidden in the heart, forged in hardship, invisible to the world until a single, seismic moment forces it into the light? This is a story about two worlds colliding, about a name forgotten and a promise that was never broken. It's a story about a waitress, an arrogant CEO, and a truth that was about to change everything. Elara Croft moved through the gilded dining room of the summit with a practiced invisibility. The restaurant, perched on the 95th floor of the Vance Corporation Tower, was a universe of clinking crystal, hushed power murmurs, and the scent of money sold it had its own distinct, papery fragrance. Her uniform was a crisp, anonymous black, her hair pulled back so tightly it erased her features into a mask of polite efficiency. To the patrons, she was a pair of hands, a quiet voice reciting specials, a ghost who refilled water glasses and cleared away the remnants of their opulent meals. But beneath the starched fabric, Elara was anything but invisible to herself. Every plate she carried, every polite smile she offered, was a coin dropped into the bottomless well of her late father's medical debts. His long illness had consumed everything, their savings, their home, his spirit. All that was left was this job, in this building, a place that was both a monument to her father's greatest achievement and a headstone for his memory. Sometimes, during a lull, she would stand by the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows and look down at the city sprawling below, a glittering tapestry of lights. But her gaze always drifted upwards, towards the penthouse floors, towards the office of the man who now ran it all, Julian Vance. She had never met him, but she knew his face from the covers of business magazines. A face carved from ice, with eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw and find it wanting. He was the son of her father's partner, the inheritor of a kingdom they had built together. A kingdom from which her father, Arthur Croft, had been all but erased. Julian Vance saw the world as a complex machine. People were cogs, assets, or liabilities. His father, the legendary Thomas Vance, had been a brilliant engineer, but Julian believed he had been soft, sentimental. Julian's reign was one of brutal efficiency. He was in the middle of a massive corporate restructuring, trimming what he called legacy fat, projects and people that didn't serve the bottom line with ruthless precision. He lived in the sterile air of boardrooms and balance sheets, a world away from the clatter of plates and the forced smiles of the service industry. He would never notice a waitress like Elara. He would never know that the quiet, unassuming woman clearing his table carried a secret in her heart, a legacy in her blood that was every bit as powerful as his own. He was about to learn that the most valuable assets don't always appear on a spreadsheet. The evening air in the summit was thick with tension. Julian Vance sat at the head of the most important table in the restaurant, a table overlooking the entire sparkling city. Across from him were the Japanese investors he had been courting for 6 months, a deal that would define his legacy and secure the future of his restructuring plan. His lawyer and friend, David Chin, sat to his right, his expression a mask of calm professionalism that Julian knew hid a knot of anxiety. To his left sat Marcus Thorne, a senior board member whose smile was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. Everything had to be perfect. And Elara, assigned to their table, felt the crushing weight of that perfection. She moved with quiet grace, her actions fluid and precise. She anticipated their needs, refilling a glass before it was empty, presenting each course with a silent flourish. She heard snippets of their conversation, talk of synergy, market disruption, and billion-dollar valuations. It was a language she understood better than they could ever imagine. It was the language her father had spoken, the language of dreams built from blueprints and belief. The deal was nearing its conclusion. The investors seemed pleased. Julian allowed a rare, tight smile to touch his lips. And then it happened. A young, nervous junior executive from Julian's team, desperate to impress, leaned across the table to hand over a final document. His hand trembled, and in a moment of catastrophic clumsiness, he knocked over a full glass of deep red wine. The liquid arced through the air in a horrifying slow-motion ballet, splashing directly onto the pristine white shirt of the lead investor, Mr. Tanaka. A collective gasp sucked the air from the table. The junior executive turned ghost white, stammering apologies. Mr. Tanaka, a man of immense dignity, looked down at the stains spreading across his chest with quiet dismay. Julian Vance's face, which had been on the verge of a smile, froze into a mask of pure, cold fury. His eyes, like chips of obsidian, scanned the scene, looking for someone to blame, a target for the volcanic pressure building inside him. They bypassed the terrified executive. They bypassed the shocked investors. They landed on the nearest, most convenient symbol of the service that had failed him. They landed on Elara. He didn't see that she was already moving, a clean napkin in one hand, a glass of soda water in the other, her training kicking in instantly. He saw only her uniform, her station, her presumed incompetence. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the stunned silence. "This is the service I pay for? Complete and utter incompetence." Elara paused, her hand hovering over the table. "Sir, it was an accident." "Your associate." Julian rose slightly from his chair, his presence dominating the space. He didn't care about the details. He cared about the image, the loss of control, the stain on his perfect evening. "I don't want excuses. I want perfection." "Is that too much to ask?" He looked directly at her, his gaze filled with a dismissive contempt that struck her harder than any shout. "You are a liability. You're finished. Get out. You're fired." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shattered glass. "You're fired." A simple phrase, a corporate execution delivered with the casual cruelty of a king swatting a fly. The junior executive who had caused the spill seemed to shrink into his chair, a mixture of terror and relief on his face that the CEO's wrath had been diverted. David Chin shot Julian a warning look, a subtle shake of his head that went ignored. Marcus Thorne watched with a flicker of amusement, enjoying the display of raw, unchecked power. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on the waitress, the anonymous girl in black, expecting her to crumble. They expected tears, pleading, a whispered, desperate apology. Elara did none of those things. She straightened her back, the years of quiet endurance coalescing into a spine of pure steel. She looked Julian Vance directly in the eye, and for the first time, he saw her. He didn't see a servant. He saw a profound, unshakable calm, an authority that didn't make any sense. A flicker of confusion crossed his icy features. She spoke, and her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent table with the clarity of a ringing bell. "You can't." Julian's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. The sheer audacity of the statement, from this person, in this place, was incomprehensible. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his tone dripping with condescending menace. "I am Julian Vance. I own this building, this restaurant. I can, and I just did." Elara slowly, deliberately, began to untie the strings of her apron. Her movements were unhurried, graceful. She folded the crisp linen with a precision that was almost meditative. She placed the folded apron on the edge of the table, next to a silver bread basket. It was a gesture of finality, but not of defeat. It was a gauntlet being thrown down. "No," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "You can't fire me. Because while you may own this building, Mr. Vance, you don't own the company. Not all of it." A murmur went through the table. David Chin leaned forward, his legal mind racing, trying to understand the impossible angle she was playing. Mr. Tanaka, the investor, watched the exchange with a newfound, intense curiosity, the wine stain on his shirt completely forgotten. Elara picked up her small server's notepad from the table. "We have an emergency board meeting tomorrow. 9 a.m. the main boardroom, 100th floor." She looked at Julian, her expression now holding a hint of command. "I suggest you be there. We have a great deal to discuss about the future of this company. And please," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "don't be late." Without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't scurry. She didn't flee. She walked with the quiet dignity of a queen abdicating a throne she had never wanted, leaving behind a stunned CEO, a ruined multi-billion-dollar deal, and a mystery that was now the most valuable commodity in the room. Julian Vance stared after her, the fury in his chest replaced by a cold, unsettling premonition. The waitress had not only talked back to him, she had summoned him. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what was going to happen next. The next morning, the main boardroom on the 100th floor felt like a pressurized chamber. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the tense air. Julian Vance stood at the head of the long, obsidian table, a black marble monolith that had witnessed the birth and death of corporate empires. He hadn't slept. The waitress's face, her calm, defiant eyes, had been imprinted on the back of his eyelids. Her words, "You can't fire me," echoed in his mind, an infuriating, nonsensical loop. David Chen stood by the window, reviewing a file on his tablet, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've had our people look into her, Julian. Lara Croft. There's nothing. A clean record, a string of service jobs. Her father, Arthur Croft, passed away 6 months ago after a long illness. The medical debts are substantial. It makes no sense. This is a bluff, a bizarre play for a settlement." Marcus Thorne lounged in a leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Or she's unhinged. A disgruntled employee with delusions of grandeur. You were too soft, Julian. You should have had security remove her. This meeting is a farce, an embarrassment. She's not unhinged," Julian said, his voice flat. He was replaying the moment in his mind. The certainty in her eyes. It wasn't madness. It was conviction. "There's something else here." The heavy doors to the boardroom swung open, and Lara Croft walked in. She was not the same woman from the restaurant. The anonymous black uniform was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant navy blue dress. It was classic, perfectly tailored, but had the subtle, timeless quality of something cherished and worn for important occasions. Her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. She carried no purse, only a worn, dark brown leather briefcase that looked as if it had held important documents for half a century. Her presence changed the atmosphere in the room. She was no longer a servant, she was an equal. She walked to the table, placed the briefcase on its polished surface, and met the gazes of the three men. Her eyes held no fear. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and steady. Marcus scoffed. "The audacity. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you are in, young lady? Trespassing, disrupting a major business deal." Lara ignored him completely, her attention fixed on Julian. "Mr. Vance? I believe we have some business to conclude." She clicked open the 2 brass latches on the briefcase. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent room. She didn't produce a sheaf of modern papers. Instead, she withdrew a single, thick, vellum document, yellowed with age, its text written in a heavy, fountain-pen script. She laid it on the table and pushed it towards Julian. "This," she said, "is the original 1985 partnership agreement for the founding of Vance Croft Enterprises, the company that would later be incorporated as the Vance Corporation." David Chen moved forward instinctively, his lawyer's curiosity piqued. Julian stared at the name. Croft. He had seen it in old files, a name associated with the early days, a ghost in the corporate machine. He had assumed it belonged to some minor, early investor bought out decades ago. "My father was Arthur Croft," Lara said, her voice filled with a quiet, powerful pride. "He was your father's partner. Not a junior partner. An equal partner. 50-50. She then produced a second document, more modern, but just as official. "And this is my father's last will and testament. As his sole heir, I inherited his entire estate, including his 50%, non-dilutable, founding share of this corporation." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the marble table, more vast than the city skyline outside. David Chen slowly picked up the partnership agreement, his eyes scanning the dense legal text, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally, to stunned comprehension. Marcus Thorne looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Julian Vance simply stared at Alara, the waitress, the ghost. The woman he had fired. The woman who, if she was telling the truth, was his equal. The woman who owned half of everything he saw. The boardroom, once Julian's unchallenged domain, had become a battleground. Marcus Thorne was the first to recover, his shock curdling into venomous disbelief. This is preposterous! A trick! These documents could be forgeries. A waitress from one of our restaurants suddenly appears claiming to own half the company? It's a shakedown, a pathetic, transparent fraud. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. We'll have our legal team tear this apart. We'll have you charged. Alara didn't flinch under his assault. She looked at David Chen, who was still examining the aged paper of the partnership agreement, his fingers tracing the embossed seal. Mr. Chen, she said calmly. You're the chief counsel. I'm sure you recognize the seal of the firm that drafted this document. I believe it's the same firm your father founded, the one you now lead. David looked up, his face pale. He nodded slowly, his eyes wide with amazement. It's our old letterhead. And that's my father's signature as the witness. He looked at Julian. Julian, it's real. It's ironclad. I've heard rumors, old stories about your father having a silent partner, someone who provided the initial vision while your father provided the engineering genius. I always assumed it was a myth. The reality of the situation crashed down on Julian. It wasn't anger he felt, but a profound, disorienting vertigo. His entire world, the legacy he had fought to control and reshape in his own image, had just been fractured down the middle. He looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet dignity, the unshakable confidence, it all made sense now. It wasn't arrogance. It was ownership. He finally spoke, his voice a low, controlled rumble. Why now? Why wait all these years, working in one of my restaurants, to bring this forward? My father was a humble man, Alara said, her voice softening with memory. He and your father had a disagreement years ago. Not about money, but about philosophy. About the soul of the company. My father believed the company's greatest asset was its people. Your father began to believe it was profit. So my father stepped away from the day-to-day operations. He never sold his shares because he always hoped the company would find its way back to its original purpose. He was waiting. And then he got sick. And I had to honor his memory, to pay his debts. And to see if what he built still had a heart. Marcus Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. A heart? We're a multi-billion-dollar global entity, not a charity. This is a disaster. Her philosophy would bankrupt us in a year. Julian ignored him. He was locked in a silent battle of wills with Alara. He saw the challenge in her eyes. She wasn't just claiming ownership, she was claiming the moral high ground. His mind, always 10 steps ahead, began to calculate. He couldn't fight her legally. He couldn't buy her out without liquidating half the company. He had to control her. He had to test her, to expose her as the naive idealist she was in a forum where it would count. A slow, cold smile touched his lips. All right, Miss Croft. You want to talk about the heart of this company? Let's talk about the Millfield plant. Marcus and David both looked at him in surprise. The Millfield plant was a relic, a factory in a dying town that produced a legacy component. It was losing millions a quarter. It was at the top of Julian's list to be shut down, a move the board, especially Marcus, strongly supported. It was one of your father's first projects. Julian continued, his voice like silk-wrapped steel. It's inefficient, outdated, a drain on our resources. I say we liquidate it. What do you say? Alara's expression didn't change. I say you're looking at the wrong balance sheet. You see a liability. My father saw a community. It was the answer Julian expected. The answer he wanted. Fine, he declared, standing up and pacing before the window, his silhouette a figure of immense power against the sky. "Prove it. I'll make you a deal. A test. You go to Millfield. You have 1 week. 1 week to find a solution that makes it profitable. No extra funding, no corporate support. Just you and your father's philosophy. If you succeed, you get your seat on the board, no questions asked. But if you fail, you will cede your full voting rights to me for the next 5 years. You'll be a silent partner, just like your father was." David Chen gasped. "Julian, that's an insane gamble." Marcus Thorne, however, was beaming. It was a perfect trap. The naive waitress would be humiliated, and Julian would consolidate his power. All eyes turned to Alara. Julian had offered her an impossible task, a poisoned chalice. She looked at the faces of the men before her, one filled with doubt, one with scorn, and one with the cold certainty of a predator. She thought of her father, of his belief in people, of the legacy of integrity he had left her. It was more than just a factory. It was a test of everything she stood for. She met Julian's gaze, her own clear and bright. "I accept your terms, Mr. Vance." The town of Millfield felt like a forgotten photograph, faded and curling at the edges. The sky was a perpetual, weary gray, and the brick buildings on Main Street seemed to sag under the weight of lost prosperity. The Vance Corporation factory, a sprawling complex of rust-colored steel on the edge of town, was its beating, failing heart. When Alara arrived, it wasn't in a black town car or with a team of consultants. She came on a local bus, carrying a single duffel bag, dressed in simple jeans and a worn but sturdy coat. She didn't go to the plant manager's office. She went to the diner across the street, a place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee. She just sat and listened. She heard the language of fear. Whispers about the corporate axe falling, about severance packages that wouldn't cover a month's rent, about a town that would simply cease to exist if the factory closed. The next day, she walked onto the factory floor. The plant manager, a weary man named Frank, met her with deep suspicion. He had been warned by Marcus Thorne to expect a corporate analyst and to offer minimal assistance. He saw a young woman who looked more like one of his daughter's friends than a corporate savior. "Can I help you?" he asked, his arms crossed over his chest. "I'm Alara Croft," she said simply. "I'd like to understand what you do here." For 3 days she did just that. She didn't stay in the office. She put on a hard hat and safety glasses and walked the floor. She learned the names of the line workers. She listened to Maria, who had worked the same press for 30 years, the same one her mother had worked. She talked to Sam, the young mechanic who had brilliant ideas for retrofitting the old machines but had been told for years there was no budget for innovation. She didn't talk about profit margins or efficiency metrics. She asked them about their families, their town, their pride in the work they did. They were wary at first, expecting a corporate spy. But her quiet sincerity, her genuine interest, slowly chipped away at their cynicism. She wasn't analyzing a problem, she was getting to know a family. She discovered the truth not in the financial reports Julian had given her, but in the grease-stained work orders and the frustrated sighs of the workers. The problem wasn't the people or the machinery. The machinery was old, yes, but it was meticulously maintained. The people were skilled and dedicated. The problem was the materials. For the past year, the quality of the raw steel they were receiving had been abysmal, causing constant breakdowns and a defect rate that was through the roof. It was sabotaging their output and making them look inefficient. Frank, the manager, confirmed it. "We've filed dozens of reports. Corporate tells us it's the only supplier that meets their new procurement guidelines. A company called Thorne Industries we're told to just make it work." The name hit Alara like a physical blow. Thorne Industries. Marcus Thorne. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't a legacy problem. It was deliberate sabotage. Marcus was bleeding the factory dry to justify its closure, likely to sell the land to a developer he was in league with. He wasn't just trying to shut down a factory, he was trying to erase her father's legacy and her future in one fell swoop. Armed with this knowledge, Alara didn't call corporate headquarters. She drove to the next town over, to a small, family-owned steel mill that had been the factory's supplier for 50 years before being suddenly replaced by Thorne Industries. She walked in, unannounced, and asked to speak to the owner. She didn't introduce herself as the owner of Vance Corporation. She introduced herself as Arthur Croft's daughter. And that name, in this part of the world, still meant something. It meant trust. It meant a promise. It was a key that opened a door Julian Vance's name never could. Back in his sterile penthouse office, 100 floors above the city, Julian Vance found himself adrift. The usual thrill of the market, the cold satisfaction of a perfectly executed hostile takeover, felt hollow. His focus was fractured. He would stare at the complex data streams on his wall of monitors, but his mind would drift to a pair of clear, steady eyes and a quiet voice saying, "You're looking at the wrong balance sheet." He had sent her on a fool's errand, a public execution designed to prove his point and secure his power. He expected her to fail within days. He expected a frantic call, a plea for help, an admission of defeat. But there was only silence. A profound, unnerving silence from Millfield. Impulsively, he pulled up the live security feed from the factory, a tool he used to monitor productivity. He didn't see the analyst he expected, a woman in a suit with a clipboard. He saw Lara in a hard hat, talking to a group of workers, laughing at something one of them said. He saw her in the break room, sharing a coffee with the weary plant manager, not as a boss, but as a confidant. She wasn't observing. She was connecting. This gnawing curiosity drove him to do something he hadn't done in 15 years. He went down to the corporate archives, a climate-controlled vault in the sub-basement of the tower. He requested the files on Arthur Croft. The archivist, a man who had been with the company for 50 years, looked at him with surprise. "No one's asked for these since your father passed, sir." The boxes were covered in a thin layer of dust. Inside, Julian found not just business plans and old contracts, but journals filled with his father's elegant script, and letters. Letters between Thomas Vance and Arthur Croft. He sat there for hours, surrounded by the ghosts of the two founders, and read. He discovered a partnership he never knew existed. His father, the brilliant, ruthless engineer he idolized, was only half the story. Arthur Croft was the visionary, the philosopher, the one who wrote about building a company that serves its people, not the other way around. He read about their arguments, the very schism Lara had spoken of. "Tom," Arthur had written in one letter, "you see people as components to be optimized. I see them as the fuel that makes the engine run. If you burn them out, the machine will stop, no matter how perfectly it is designed." He found the original plans for the Millfield plant. It wasn't just a factory. It was designed as the heart of a community, with plans for schools and parks funded by its profits. It was a dream. A dream his father had abandoned in the name of progress, and a dream Julian was about to kill in the name of efficiency. He saw a photograph he'd never seen before. A younger Thomas Vance smiling, with his arm around another man, Arthur Croft. And standing in front of them were two small children. A little boy with a serious expression, himself. And a little girl with bright, curious eyes holding her father's hand, Lara. They had known each other once. Before the world of profit and loss had built a wall between them. A profound sense of shame washed over Julian. He hadn't just been blind to Lara. He had been blind to his own history, to the very foundation of the empire he commanded. Lara wasn't trying to take something from him. She was trying to return something that had been lost. David Chin found him there late that night, sitting in the silence of the archive, an old photograph in his hand. "Julian? What are you doing down here?" Julian looked up, and for the first time, David saw not a CEO, but a man wrestling with his own soul. "I was wrong, David," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong about everything." The day of the board meeting arrived. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The story of the CEO and the waitress had become a whispered legend within the company's upper echelons. Marcus Thorne entered the boardroom with the swagger of a victorious general. He had spent the week compiling a damning report on the Millfield plant, filled with charts and projections showcasing its spectacular failure. He had already poisoned the well, briefing key board members on the inevitable outcome of Julian's reckless gamble. He was confident that by the end of the day, Alara Croft would be a powerless footnote, and his own influence would be stronger than ever. Julian was quiet, his face an unreadable mask. Davidson stood behind him, a silent pillar of support. Then, the doors opened and Alara walked in. She looked different again. The quiet confidence was still there, but now it was overlaid with a new strength, a certainty forged in the fire of the past week. She carried her father's old leather briefcase. Well, Marcus began, his voice oozing condescension. Look what the bus dragged in. Welcome back from your little field trip, Miss Croft. We're all very eager to hear about the miracles you've performed. He gestured to the screen at the end of the room. But first, allow me to present the facts. For 20 minutes, Marcus laid out a clinical, brutal case for the factory's closure. He presented data showing plummeting output, rising costs, and a catastrophic defect rate. The conclusion is inescapable, he finished, turning to the board. The plant is a relic. Its workers are unmotivated, its machinery is obsolete. It is a cancer on our balance sheet, and it must be cut out. He then turned to Alara with a smug smile. Now, I believe Miss Croft has a rebuttal. Please enlighten us. Tell us about the heart of the company. Alara walked to the head of the table. She didn't use the screen. She opened her briefcase and took out a single, grease-stained work order. This, she began, her voice clear and resonant, belongs to a woman named Maria. She has worked at the Millfield plant for 30 years. She can calibrate a Series 7 press by sound alone. She is not unmotivated. She is heartbroken. She then laid out her findings with devastating precision. She spoke of the workers' dedication, of their ingenuity in keeping the old machines running. And then she delivered the killing blow. The factory is failing. That much is true. But it is not because of the people or the equipment. It is because it is being intentionally starved of quality materials. She produced shipping manifests, supplier invoices, and a signed affidavit from the owner of the original steel mill. She laid out a clear, undeniable trail of evidence showing that Marcus Thorne, through a shell corporation called Thorne Industries, had been forcing the factory to accept substandard steel, causing the very failures he was now using to justify its closure. The color drained from Marcus's face. This is slander. Lies. Alara then played her final card. A small audio recording. It was the voice of the plant manager, Frank, detailing the pressure campaign from Marcus's office, the threats to his job if he complained, the explicit instructions to use only the Thorne Industries supply line. The boardroom was utterly silent. Marcus Thorne was exposed, his greed and treachery laid bare for all to see. He sputtered, trying to form a defense, but his eyes darted around the room and found only cold, accusing stares. Just as he was about to launch into another tirade of denial, Julian Vance stood up. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. That's enough, Marcus. All eyes snapped to him. Miss Croft is correct, Julian said, his gaze fixed on Alara, filled with a new, profound respect. I have reviewed the historical data myself. The decline at Millfield began exactly when the supplier contract was switched to Thorne Industries. Her findings are not just credible, they are the undeniable truth. He turned to the stunned board members. Marcus Thorne has not only attempted to defraud this company, he has betrayed the legacy of its founders. His position on this board is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The great gatekeeper, the man of scorn and shadows, was finished. He stared at Julian, then at Alara, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred, before two security guards entered and quietly led him away. The climax was over. The villain was vanquished. But the story was far from finished. The true test for Julian and Alara was just beginning. With Marcus gone, a vacuum of power and possibility filled the room. The board members, still reeling from the dramatic exposé, looked from Julian to Alara, unsure of where the company now stood. Elara stepped forward again, not with accusations, but with a plan. She presented a detailed proposal to revitalize the Millfield plant. It involved reinstating the old local supplier, investing a modest amount in the retrofitting ideas proposed by the mechanic Sam, and creating a profit-sharing incentive for the workers. It was a plan built not on ruthless cuts, but on trust, innovation, and community. My father believed, she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, that when you invest in people, they give you back something far more valuable than profit. They give you loyalty. They give you excellence. Julian, who had remained standing, addressed the board. Miss Croft's father was the soul of this company. My father was its mind. For too long, we have been operating with only a mind, and we have nearly lost our way. I give my full support to Miss Croft's proposal. I ask this board to do the same. The vote was unanimous. A wave of relief and quiet excitement passed through the room. Elara had not just saved a factory, she had charted a new course for the entire corporation. Later that evening, the tower was quiet. Elara stood in Julian's office, looking out at the city lights through the same panoramic window she had once gazed at from the restaurant below. The view was different from up here. Colder, more distant. Julian entered the office and stood beside her, the space between them charged with unspoken words. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Not just for that night in the restaurant, but for the last 15 years. I inherited my father's ambition but none of his partner's wisdom. I tried to erase Arthur Croft's name from this company's history because I was afraid of it. Afraid of a legacy I didn't understand. He turned to face her. You came here and in 1 week, you taught me more about this company, and about myself, than I've learned in my entire career. You didn't just save a factory. You saved us. Elara looked at him, at the man who had once been a symbol of everything cold and ruthless in the world. She saw the cracks in the ice, the flicker of warmth and regret in his eyes. My father never hated your father, she said quietly. He was just sad that they lost their way. He always believed that one day, the company would find its balance again. With your help, I think it finally can, Julian said. He took a hesitant step closer. The tension that had been a battle of wills, a clash of ideologies, had slowly, imperceptibly, transformed into something else. It was an attraction of opposites who had found their common center. You belong here, Elara. Not just as an owner. As a leader, and you? She asked, a small smile playing on her lips. What is your role in this new company? He returned her smile, and for the first time, it reached his eyes, melting the last of the frost. I think my role is to learn from the new boss. The moment stretched, filled with the promise of a new partnership, one that would be built not on a dusty contract, but on mutual respect, shared vision, and the undeniable spark that now arced between them. The king had met his queen, not in a fairy tale castle, but in the heart of a corporate empire that was finally rediscovering its soul. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Vance Croft Corporation was reborn. The name itself, restored on Julian's insistence, was a symbol of the new era. The partnership between Julian and Elara was a perfect synthesis of mind and soul. His sharp, strategic acumen, now tempered with her empathetic, people-first approach, created a synergy that propelled the company to new heights. The stock soared, but more importantly, morale, which had been at an all-time low, skyrocketed. The revitalization of the Millfield plant became a legendary case study in business schools. It was thriving, its workers now invested partners in its success. The town was coming back to life, a testament to Elara's belief that a company could be a force for good. The story of the waitress who owned half the company became an inspiration, a modern fable whispered in break rooms and boardrooms alike. One evening, a year after their first disastrous meeting, Julian took Elara back to the summit. The restaurant was the same, the crystal still gleamed, but everything felt different. They were seated at the best table, the very one where he had fired her. The manager, flustered and deeply apologetic, tried to personally serve them, but Elara greeted him with a warm smile and put him at ease. They weren't there as conquerors returning to the scene of a victory. They were there as partners, celebrating a new beginning. Julian looked at her across the table, the city lights twinkling behind her like a diamond necklace. She was wearing the same simple navy blue dress she had worn to that first board meeting. She was no longer a Lara Croft, the invisible waitress, or a Lara Croft, the mysterious heir. She was simply a Lara, the woman who had seen the best in people, the best in his company, and somehow, the best in him. "A year ago," he said, raising his glass, "I thought I had everything under control. I saw the world in black and white, profit and loss. You brought the color back, you just needed to look at the right balance sheet," she replied, her eyes sparkling. Their hands met across the table, a simple touch that sealed a partnership far more profound than any legal document. It was a promise to lead together, to build something that would last, something worthy of the two men who had started it all with a handshake and a shared dream. "So I ask you again, what is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the title they hold, or the integrity they show when they have nothing? Is it the power they wield, or the quiet courage they find in their heart? Perhaps true worth is not something you can ever own or inherit. It is something you must prove, every single day, in the choices you make and the people you choose to see. What do you think? Have you ever felt invisible, knowing you had so much more to offer? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that a person's value can never be judged by their job title.